who would be climbing, I'm sorry? Those people who would be climbing, out of Mill Creek Canyon or Parley's Canyon up to Grandeur Peak or Mount Air, their view at the top of that canyon would be basically down into this huge gravel pit. So the recreation impacts are also significant. The noise and light pollution of a gravel pit are significant, not only for people driving up at the canyon and the scenic degradation of having all of that, that disturbed land and the noise and the light, but to the wildlife as well. And then finally, about anywhere from a quarter mile to a mile as the crow flies from the gravel pit are about 75 to 100 cabins, many of which are 75 to 100 years old in the Mount Air historic cabin community. And the next slide just shows you a couple of those a couple of those cabins. So these cabins are many of them built of unreinforced sandstone block construction, or they're built on stilts on the side of very steep mountainsides. And so the threat to, and as Linda talked about, the competing interests of property owners, one of the competing interests are the rights of the property owners. And full disclosure, I own a cabin in Mount Air. The competing rights of the property owners to the property rights of Jesse Lastly, who bought this piece of property to put the gravel pit on. Next slide. So who are the entities that are making the decisions about this? I won't go into all of them in any detail. The Utah Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining, sometimes known as DOGM. They divide these things into small mines and large mines. There was a long process earlier this year where Tree Farm, where Jesse Lastly wanted to have both a small and large mine permit. They said, no, you can't do that. They pulled the large mine permit and said, we'll just do a small mine permit for now. But clearly their intention is to do the small mine and then work the large mine permit through the process. The Division of Air Quality we'll be talking about in a minute. They control the air emissions. Division of Water Rights and Water Quality controls some of the other issues related to water, and Laura will be talking more about that. They need a right of way from the Department of Transportation to access their property. There's no road into their property through their own property right now. So that would be an issue. And then all of this could be changed by actions of the Utah legislature, and Carl's going to talk about that in a minute. Salt Lake County filed a new revised zoning ordinance in April of 2022 that would exclude any new mines from the Wasatch Mountains as a conditional use. They would need a conditional use permit from Salt Lake County. They now, under this new ordinance, would not be able to get one. They have filed a lawsuit in 3rd District Court challenging the legality of what this county commission did in changing the zoning ordinance. And then finally, Salt Lake City has jurisdiction over the water supply, and Laura's going to talk more about that. So the next slide. So I'm just going to talk about how Utah regulates gravel pit emissions, and it's quite weak. The legislature has not given the Division of Air Quality really very much authority in regulating these. This is the dust coming off the Harper's Quarry, the quarry that's 1/10 the size of the one that's being proposed in Parley's Canyon on a windy day in Parley's Canyon. If you go to the next slide. So the EPA has what are called criteria pollutants. There's 6 different pollutants that are regulated by the EPA, and every area has to come into attainment with these standards, these health standards. And Brian's going to talk about the problems with these as health standards in a minute. But they have these thresholds that an airshed is supposed to meet. And if you don't meet them, you're considered to be in non-attainment. And you have to submit to the EPA what's called a state implementation plan to get you back into attainment so that you don't have emissions that exceed these health standards. The one we're concerned about with gravel pit is primarily what's called particulate pollution. There's large particles called PM10s, and there's smaller particles called PM2.5s. The dust that comes off a gravel pit is primarily the larger particles, and the diesel emissions that come out of the machinery are primarily the smaller particles. So when an entity wants to set up something like this gravel pit, they have to submit a proposal to the Division of Air Quality. It's called a new source review, the new source of emissions. And as part of that, they have a gravel pit has to submit what's called a fugitive dust control plan. And the problem with that is that it's not really something that the division can say, we don't think this is a good place for a gravel pit. They can't say, we don't think you have the ability to do this. They just need to, it's a checklist. And the entity says, we promise to do this and this and this and this and this, and we'll control the dust by spraying water on it. And if they check all those boxes, the division doesn't really have a lot of ability to turn them down. The problem with the division's review is that they don't, if the gravel pit says we're going to spray water on the dust to keep it under control, the division doesn't ask them where are you going to get the water. They just take their word for the fact that they will have the water and that they'll be able to spray it and control the dust. The division only does inspections every 12 to 18 months. If a citizen were to complain, they might go in and take a look otherwise, but in terms of routine inspections, they only go in every 12 to 18 months. And when they go in, they have this little opacity tool where they hold it up to at the boundary of the gravel pit, and they see if the dust exceeds a 10% opacity. And if it doesn't, they say you're in compliance. So they do that once every 12 to 18 months. But the problem is that the opacity detector does not work at night. You don't have to monitor the dust coming off a gravel pit at night. And they don't have to control their dust if the wind speed is in excess of 25 miles an hour. And we have one source that indicates that the wind in Parley's Canyon exceeds 25 miles an hour about 40% of the time. And then finally, while the company is supposed to keep records of their dust monitoring and their dust control activity, the public isn't allowed to see those records. So we don't really know. We can't look at the records of the gravel pits and say, are you doing what you're supposed to be doing? So our concern about the fugitive dust control plan is it doesn't really protect Utahns from being exposed to this dust. And if you go to the next slide, I just wanted to address one other issue. Well, where are we going to get the limestone if we don't get it here? And this map just shows all of the dark gray areas on this map show high calcium limestone deposits in northern Utah. So there's really no shortage of places we can get limestone. We don't want to have someone else have this in their backyard, but we think there should be ways of getting this material in places where it's not going to have the impacts that I listed on my previous slide. So with that, I'll stop and turn the time over to Brian to talk about what this could do to your health.
Thanks, Scott. We'll pause for a minute to try and get my slides on the screen. I'm Dr. Brian Moench, president of Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment, one of the largest civic organizations of physicians in the Western United States, with about 450 physicians and about 3,000 members of the lay public. We are going to exchange hand signals, determining whether or not we are live with the screen. We have a daytime job as football referees, I think Sean and I do. Okay, we borrow or bastardize our slogan from Big Pharma and ask you to ask your doctor if clean air is right for you. And if your doctor doesn't know the answer, then you need to get a new doctor. We think clean air is perhaps one of the most important environmental issues in the state of Utah, maybe the most important. In fact, numerous polls in the last several years have identified air pollution as the #1 concern of voters in the state of Utah, and we're glad to have contributed to that awareness. A lot of my talk, if I would say just about all of my presentations, are notorious for causing post-traumatic stress disorder. So I apologize in advance, but nonetheless, I'm going to give you a lot of information, and a lot of it's true. So this is the hand signal for next slide. Very good. Air pollution is, in fact, the #1 environmental cause of human deaths worldwide. It contributes to 4 of the 5 leading causes of death, which are strokes, heart disease, lung disease, and cancer. It kills more people annually worldwide than road accidents, violence, fires, and wars combined. And if you want to simplify the consequences of air pollution exposure, you can think of it as just about all the same diseases that we know are related to smoking cigarettes are also precipitated by air pollution exposure. And so it includes this dizzying list: heart attacks, heart failure, strokes, acceleration of aging, sudden death, cancers, brain and neurodegenerative diseases, cognitive loss, behavioral disorders, including suicide and depression, all types of lung diseases, impaired fetal development, just about every type of poor pregnancy outcome, including birth defects, stillbirths, type 2 diabetes, and inflammatory bowel disease, and many more. And those of you who don't yet have post-traumatic stress disorder, trust me, you're going to get it.
We got you. We got your back.
Okay. All right. So we're on the correct slide. Now, one of the reasons why it does this is because these tiny particles of the pollution, or the particulate pollution subset of all of our pollution problems, these tiny particles can actually penetrate any cell in your body, in any of your critical organs. And in fact, we have studies that show, in fact, all of us sitting here have virtually all of our critical organs, including our brain, our heart, our blood vessels, our liver, our kidneys, are contaminated by these air pollution particles. This is an electron micrograph that shows, back, back. Again, this is one problem with me not managing my own slides. Back. Oh, we're going in the wrong direction. My mother told me that all the time when I was in high school. There we go. There we are. Okay, this is, no. Okay. Aha, we have arrived at an electron micrograph of a human cell. And these little red arrows are not there normally, but they are pointing out little teeny specks, nanoparticles, if you will, of air pollution that have penetrated the cell. Now, that's important because they can also penetrate any of the cell's subsets, like the nucleus of the cell, and there they can interfere with the functioning and the integrity of chromosomes. And so the impact on human health can be almost limitless. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. You jumped ahead of me, but that's fine. Do not change the slide. Mm-hmm. Among the things we know is that inhaled pollution nanoparticles can be detected in our blood and our urine within 15 minutes after inhaling them. And we know that these same particles can be detectable in our body still 3 months later. Now, some of these particles may be exhaled, or they may be excreted in some other way, but the bottom line is we are in a constant steady state of being contaminated by these particles that we're inhaling. And incidentally, I'll mention this a little bit later, your lungs are not the only avenue by which you can be exposed to these air pollution particles. And in particular, these particles tend to accumulate in the worst possible places. This is a kind of a diagram of a blood vessel that has been inflamed, and it shows a deposit of atherosclerosis, calcified. These particles tend to accumulate in the worst possible places, in these kinds of places that all of you sitting here have going on right now, in critical arteries that feed your lungs, your heart, and your brain. Air pollution nanoparticles tend to preferentially deposit themselves in these worst possible places where there is already inflammation of your blood vessels. Next slide. So once inhaling these particles, you might be tempted to think that, in fact, when the air clears up, oh, the problem's solved and we're good to go. Not true, because we know that, in fact, from many clinical studies, that the mortality rate related to air pollution events does not go back down to normal, in many cases for as much as 30 days after the air pollution event is over. And in fact, other studies that show we are at increased mortality risk from pollution we were exposed to decades ago. Next slide. So if you want a simplified way to look at how air pollution affects you physiologically, it creates a chemically mediated inflammatory response. Think of it as endogenous barbecuing. And so in addition to these particles that contaminate all of these critical cells in your critical organs, it creates a systemic response of inflammation that then triggers virtually all of the adult chronic diseases that we know are related to inflammation. And next slide. We also know that it's actually even worse than that, because we know that the air pollution that a person breathes today may in fact not only affect their own health, but the health of future generations. Let me give you a specific example. If you have a pregnant mother that is exposed to air pollution, we know those particles can actually penetrate the placenta and be carried to the fetus and interfere with fetal development. So from one episode, there's the mother that's affected, there's the fetus that is affected. If the fetus is a female, the fetus's eggs are also developing. So one weekend exposure of pollution can right there affect 3 generations, the mother, the fetus, and the fetus's eggs. But it doesn't end there, because we know that, in fact, because of the proximity of these tiny particles to our chromosomes, they can interfere with the chemical bath that our chromosomes sit in and change the way chromosomes function, turning some on and turning others off in an inappropriate way that can be passed on to subsequent generations. We know, in fact, that air pollution that teenagers are breathing now can actually have an impact on children that they may conceive in the years down the road. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about air pollution's impact and discuss myths versus facts, because we oftentimes see state employees, industry representatives, the public, and even some physicians who don't understand a lot of these key points about air pollution. Next slide. Myth number 1, air quality that meets state and national regulations is safe. There is no safe level of air pollution. In the same way there's no number of cigarettes that you can smoke that is safe, there's no safe amount of air pollution you can breathe. It all has an impact. And in fact, you can say in some ways that our state and federal regulations are a little bit of a disadvantage, because they create the false impression that if we meet a standard, everything's fine. That is not true. And in fact, go to the next slide. This is a study where one of the key researchers was Dr. Arden Pope at Brigham Young University, who is one of the world's premier air pollution researchers. And what it shows is the relationship between the most critical outcome, which is sudden death, and 3 different types of air pollution: smoking, secondhand cigarette exposure, and community air pollution. They all follow this same trajectory, which is it's not a linear relationship. The worst impact per dose of exposure is at the lowest doses. Now, let me interpret that for you in a different study. Other studies have shown that, in fact, smoking 1 cigarette a day is almost half as much risk as smoking an entire pack. That follows that same sort of hyperbolic trajectory, where the greatest effect per dose is at the lowest concentrations. So, in fact, if we have a good clean air day, but even we can make it even better, that has more public health benefit than if we have a terrible day and we can make it a little better and people feel a little better. We're not having as much impact on public health because of where we sit on that curve. Now, I should also say, next slide, air pollution is not the only thing that there's no safe level of. There's no safe level of exposure to country western music, proven by many studies. And those of you who object to that conclusion, there's no safe level of opera that you can be exposed to either. Next slide. Second myth is I don't have any symptoms, so it's not harming me. Well, the fact is it's harming virtually all of us. I don't personally have any symptoms from it, but because of some health problems that I have that don't create symptoms, actually air pollution is life-threatening to me. Many of us are in this situation as well. It doesn't mean because you don't have symptoms that you're not being harmed by the air pollution that we're all exposed to. Next slide. And the average person from numerous studies, in probably the average urban setting, loses about 2 years of their life expectancy due to the air pollution that they're exposed to. In Utah, it may be a little bit more, but some studies suggest that's about a typical way to predict the loss of life years due to air pollution exposure. Next slide. Myth number 3, you've heard this phrase many times, and I'm certain. Our air quality may be unhealthy for sensitive groups. Well, and then the thought, well, I'm not in a sensitive group, so what's the big deal? Well, the fact is there are important genetic differences between people and gender differences in their susceptibility to air pollution. People of the same age, of the same baseline quality of health, may have dramatically different genetic susceptibility to air pollution. So what is safe for one person is not necessarily safe for another person. And it's not necessarily because one person is older, one person is younger, or has other baseline medical problems. Just the genetic differences alone may make a great deal of variability. Oh, you're running ahead of me. That's okay. We're just ruining my presentation. That's all right. Where are we? I forgot. What myth are we on? We're on myth number 4. Oh, I thought, oh, there we go. Okay, myth number 4. Our average air pollution is okay. So we only have excessive air pollution on a few days, so it isn't really a problem. In about 2012, I was on a panel discussion with the state director of the Division of Air Quality, and he made the statement that, well, our air quality is good 95% of the time, so therefore there really isn't a problem. Well, let me give you an example. The weather in Florida is good 95 to 99% of the time, but occasionally they have a hurricane. And the people whose lives have been destroyed and their homes have been obliterated by Hurricane Ian, their weather was good 99% of the time. So because our air pollution problem is perhaps limited by some people's estimation to only 5% of the time, what's the problem? Well, the fact is, even short-term air pollution matters. Next slide. Averages do not tell the whole story. For instance, if you're in Tornado Alley in Oklahoma, and a tornado comes and with 240-mile-an-hour winds obliterates your home, well, before the tornado hit, the wind speeds were 10 miles an hour. After the tornado's gone, the wind speeds are 10 miles an hour. It doesn't mean your home's okay because the average during that day was okay. Your home's obliterated. Well, your health can follow the same sort of trajectory. Next slide. Timing is critical. If you have a fetus in its mother's womb and it's exposed to a weekend of air pollution, that can have a lifelong effect on their susceptibility to a number of diseases. Just one weekend of exposure. We have studies that actually demonstrate this. So the timing of the exposure is critical. If you're a person, say you're 65 years old, and you have a developing atherosclerotic plaque in your left main coronary artery, and you're on the verge of a lethal heart attack, but you don't have any symptoms, one weekend of air pollution may make that atherosclerotic plaque friable, let loose, and basically kill you instantly. Timing is critical to a lot of the outcomes that we know are due to air pollution. What myth are we on now? 5? Okay, regulatory strategies treat particulate air pollution as equally toxic regardless of the source. So all types must be equally toxic. The fact is not all particulate air pollution is created equal. There are different toxic profiles to wood smoke, to what comes out of an automobile tailpipe or an industrial smokestack or a gravel pit. Next slide. Myth number 6, the Utah DAQ and the EPA will protect you from excessive pollution. In fact, you are kidding, right? your microenvironment can be vastly different than overall air quality. For example, if your next door neighbor burns wood in a fireplace to heat their home or just for ambiance, you can have 100 times more air pollution in your house than what the rest of the neighborhood is exposed to. And we have studies from California that actually demonstrate this. Because of these very localized sources of pollution, some people can be exposed to dramatically different levels of pollution when the rest of the community is enjoying fairly clean air. And that's obviously relevant to people who are downwind of a gravel pit. Next slide. Myth number 7, PM 2.5 levels are what really matter. Well, that's a good clean air day. It's actually not true. And in fact, the EPA is measuring the wrong thing. What matters is not PM 2.5, and I won't get into the physiology of how PM 2.5 levels are determined, but what really matters is the number of particles that you're exposed to. Next slide, and I'll demonstrate why that's the case. Air pollution particles are captured on a filter, and they determine the mass of these particles, and the filters are designed to capture particles 2.5 microns in size and smaller. So you take the mass of the particles captured and you calculate the concentration of that mass and say, no, the PM 2.5 today is 10. That doesn't really tell you what you want to know, because if you take this brass ball, let's say that's a big air pollution particle, maybe it's a PM 10. It has the same mass as all these little silver balls, but the silver balls have a much greater surface area, and it's surface area that matters. So if in fact you hear the PM 2.5 levels are 10 and you think that's pretty good, that's not really what's relevant. What's relevant is how many particles does that represent? And we don't even actually measure that. I pointed that out to the EPA about 4 months ago, and they just stood there and didn't say a thing. But that's in fact physiologically why air pollution is important, is because of the surface area. And these tinier particles actually are more likely to have chemicals and heavy metals attached to them, enhancing their toxicity. Next slide. All right, here's a myth number 8, that a Parley's mine will be closer to construction sites and reduce diesel emissions. I'm going to read to you an email that I got about 2 weeks ago. About a month ago, I happened to be driving down Parley's Canyon about the time that a Kilgore truck with double trailers was leaving the existing quarry. So I thought I would follow it. It turned from I-80 onto I-215 south and then continued to I-15 southbound. Destination, Kilgore operations, 1500 7024 South, Pony Express Drive in Draper, point of the mountain west of the freeway. The distance to this location from the quarry is 28 miles. Today, I intercepted another Kilgore truck, same sort of thing. Ended up at 8200 west, 5400 south. I noticed a large plume of dust coming from the lead truck at one time as I followed, and it continued throughout the entire 28 miles of the truck's trip. The idea that these trucks in this current mine in Parley's Canyon are positioned so that truck trips are minimized is absolutely not true, nor will it be true of a new mine in Parley's Canyon. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about quarry dust. There are numerous studies that show, in fact, that the public health outcomes of being exposed to dust are pretty much the same outcomes as being exposed to other types of pollution. Now, the particles do frequently, in fugitive dust, they're frequently a little bigger. But in fact, we know the lungs are not the only route of exposure. You can, in fact, have air pollution penetrate your skin. We know that air pollution can penetrate your nasal mucosa. We know that air pollution can be swallowed. All of those routes are important. And so the idea, and you'll hear this from state regulators sometimes and from industry representatives, well, the fugitive dust is really represented by particles that are, most of them are too big to really be of concern. Not true. And we have numerous studies throughout the world that show populations exposed to more dust have more public health consequences. And one of the things, next slide. One of the reasons why is because a lot of the dust can be crystalline silica. And a lot of you may be familiar with that name, but not really understand what's the issue here. Crystalline silica is a potent invasion of your lungs, and it causes chronic exposure to crystalline silica. It can cause silicosis. It can also cause lung cancer. Not all crystalline silica is created equal. In fact, it matters how freshly the crystalline silica was created by the blasting and the grinding, because the sharper particles, and this is an electron micrograph of crystalline silica, the sharper the particles, the more they can shred the 500 million alveoli or lung sacs in your lungs and cause scarring and contraction of your lungs and causing you to lose lung function and increase your susceptibility to cancer. We don't know the levels of crystalline silica that occur as fugitive dust from all the gravel pits in the state because we don't monitor it. We have no idea. But other studies from California suggest that it can be quite variable, as little as 2% of the dust to as much as 95% of the dust, but we don't even monitor it. In fact, only a couple of states even pay any attention to it. One of them is New York and one of them is California, but we don't pay any attention to it in Utah. Next, and I think this is our last slide, is the diesel exhaust. Studies have shown that diesel exhaust is in fact a potent carcinogen, and people who are exposed occupationally to diesel exhaust probably increase their risk of lung cancer about 300%. The public that is frequently exposed to diesel exhaust increases their risk of lung cancer about 50%. I know of two nurses who just contacted me in the last 2 weeks, never smoked their entire life, who both have stage 4 lung cancer. And it's from the air pollution that they breathed here along the Wasatch Front. About 25% of lung cancer is probably due to the air pollution that we all breathe. So this is a public health issue. It's an aesthetic issue, and it's a water issue, and I'll let the others talk about that, but it is unquestionably a public health issue to allow a gravel pit in Parley's Canyon.
Thank you, Brian and Dr. Moench and Dr. Williams. I'm Laura Briefer, and I am the director of Salt Lake City's Department of Public Utilities. And before I start, Brian, I am interested in buying your books. Secondly,
that will increase the sales about 400%.
Secondly, I'm a solutions-oriented person, and I happen to have a significant other who's a marriage and family therapist, but he will do PTSD therapy too, just in case. But I didn't that didn't cause me PTSD. Third, there's actually been a third fire in Parley's Canyon, to Dr. Williams' point, in recent times. That was in 2015, which also caused evacuations. That fire was caused by target shooting at the former police mutual aid shooting range that's in there. And that shooting range actually was on property that was leased by the Police Mutual Aid Association on Salt Lake City's property. And because we were so concerned about fire risk in Parley's Canyon, that range has been closed to mitigate that risk. In addition, there are other fire risk mitigation activities happening towards the end of this month. Again, because, if you look at the State Division of Fire and Forestry State Lands fire risk maps of that area is high risk. And so having activities like a gravel pit in this area just increases the risk. At the same time, a lot of us are trying to decrease that risk. I'm here really, though, to talk about water. So my organization is tasked with providing safe drinking water to more than 365,000 people in the Salt Lake Valley. That water goes to everyone in Salt Lake City. It also provides a great amount of water to portions of Mill Creek, Holiday, Cottonwood Heights, and then smaller areas of South Salt Lake, Murray, and Midvale. So our water service area is quite big, and there are a lot of people who rely on that water and have been for the last century and will continue to rely on that water. Our sources of drinking water are primarily surface water sources. So that includes surface water that comes from City Creek Canyon, Parley's Canyon, Big Cottonwood Canyon, and Little Cottonwood Canyon. in addition to water that is also coming down from the Wasatch Mountains, that's stored in Deer Creek Reservoir. So that accounts for about 90% of our water supplies, and I'll talk a little bit about why that's so important in the context of this mine in a little bit. Um, then we have some groundwater as our surface water, as our water source to about 10%. So not a day goes by now that I'm not being interviewed in the media about the mega drought, about Great Salt Lake. Not a day goes by when I don't talk to my colleagues around the Western United States and across the country where water is an issue. And in the Western part of the states, water scarcity, aridification, and climate change are really causing a lot of very big stressors on our water resources. And so just to tag on to something that Dr. Williams said earlier, and that, this particular proposal in a very important drinking water supply area is an addition to a lot of other proposals that are out there that also could have an impact to water resources. So there's a larger context there of potential cumulative impacts on water resources in our region. And some of those that were pointed out were the Utah Lake Restoration Project with the construction of islands, the large transportation proposals in Little Cottonwood Canyon, such as the gondola, and other things. So anyway, when I get involved in these types of issues, it's really to advocate for the community that relies on a reliable, safe, and affordable drinking water supply. And there were a number of things related to water that I flagged in this proposal, that these are questions that just have not been answered. And probably by design, because I don't think so far in the process through the Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining, that's something that is asked as part of the process, but it's something that we would ask. And one of those is in order to mitigate the environmental risks with dust and with water quality, water is going to be needed. Water is going to be needed to spray, to do dust control. It will be needed in settling ponds so that the water that's released from the mine site meets regulatory requirements for clean water as it goes downstream. And then oftentimes water is used actually in the process itself to clean and wash the material that comes out of the mine. So we don't have any idea of what the proposed quantity of water needed for those processes would be. We have asked many times, but have not gotten that information. It may be because they don't know the answer to that yet. So that's important to us because Salt Lake City, beginning in 1888, acquired most of the water rights in Parley's Canyon. In addition, in 1914, we constructed Mountain Dell Dam, and then later we constructed Little Dell Dam. We have a water treatment plant in that canyon. That is an incredible source of drinking water for the city and all of the people that we serve. And there aren't really any substantial water rights in the canyon that aren't owned by us. And Tree Farm does have a couple of water rights that are pretty small in size. I don't know that they would be sufficient to operate a mine. In addition, those water rights are not located on the proposed mine site itself. So water resources, just in general, that's something that we have a question about. In terms of environmental impacts, we also have a lot of questions about what kind of analysis would be required to ensure that, for instance, dust emanating from the site or particulate matter emanating from the site wouldn't impact the quality of our sources of water. For instance, deposition of atmospheric dust and particulate matter can actually introduce pollutants into water. Mercury is a good example of that, but with a mine site, we have potential particulate matter that contains metals and other things that are something that we're regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act for. We also have concerns about what might go downstream. So Salt Lake City doesn't have jurisdiction in terms of stormwater until that stormwater hits our city boundaries, and then we are bound by state regulations to deal with pollution that's coming into the waterways in our community. And so we're very interested to know how water quality controls would be implemented with respect to any kind of effluent that comes from the mine. I'll also just step back again into that macro level on overall water supply and demand and this drought. So in 2019, I updated the city's 40-year water supply and demand plan. We do that periodically when we see changed conditions occurring in and around the environment and in socially and with land use. And at that time, I updated that plan because we had a new state corrections facility that was sited within our water service area. And we also we're seeing the inland port and northwest quadrant become more developed and with anticipated additional future development, plus climate change, plus changes in regulations concerning water. So what we found in that last iteration of our water supply and demand plan is that by 2060, the current and future water resources that the city has will not be, they will not be good enough to meet what our projected demand is, in which case we'll have to do much more conservation. And I think that just speaks to sort of that context of all of these different pressures on our water resources, and this being another one that adds sort of a cumulative impact to our water resources. The last thing I will keep this pretty short because if there are questions, I want to answer them. And I didn't have a nice PowerPoint presentation for you today, and I know Carl has a lot he wants to say too. But there are when we talk about water and we talk about water-related policies, it is a very kind of complex structure. So you've got water policies at the federal level, the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act that are the primary drivers for water quality in our when we're thinking about water resources. The state of Utah has primacy to implement the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so the Department of Environmental Quality, both their Division of Drinking Water and their Division of Water Quality, are the ones that implement both of those large bodies of rules and regulations to keep our water clean and safe. In addition, water resources are managed under Title 73 of Utah Code, and that's where things like water rights live. And in terms of this proposal, I mentioned tree farms to water rights. In order for those water rights to be used at the site, they would need to file a change application with the State Division of Water Rights and the state engineer. And that change application would have to be approved as to the quantity of water available, the point that it's being diverted from. So they would have to move where their current points of diversion are to another location. And the point of use, what that water is used for, and then it would have to be accounted for and monitored. That's a public process. So that division of the state will have some regulatory authority to look at that. And then the final body of regulation is Salt Lake City's own ordinances. So we have a watershed ordinance in Title 17 of City Code. And that does a few things. First of all, that establishes a designated water service area for the city. That's something that we did recently in 2021 after Amendment D to the state constitution told us that cities needed to do that. And our water service area does not include that Parley's Canyon area. one of the arguments in the lawsuit filed against Salt Lake City is that we're wrong about that and that we should be the water service provider to that area. That's something that we disagree with. The other piece is our watershed ordinance that protects water quality. And the watershed ordinance under Title 17 of City Code is actually further, it's appropriate further up the canyon. That's where the boundary of that ordinance is. But this mine site is contiguous to where that watershed authority comes in. And so again, we're very interested to see what the spillover effect is to the protected watershed in terms of things like fire risk and water quality risks to those water supplies. So we're continuing to monitor and watch the situation. Salt Lake City has been supportive of Salt Lake County's ordinance amendment to its zoning code. And we are, of course, working on the litigation that's been filed against us regarding water. And I'll turn it over to Carl.
Cool. Well, thank you for having me tonight and for hosting this panel on this issue. It's a really important issue. And there's, as everybody's mentioned, there is a lot confronting our region. And I think, you know, I think our policymakers, our lawmakers like to look at these things in silos. But as Laura pointed out, there are a lot of cumulative effects and cumulative impacts. And I before I get into it, I just want to say how lucky we are to have somebody like Laura Briefer heading up our watershed and our public utilities department, because she sees the broader picture and she sees the implications of all of these things. And I think that's really unique for somebody in a government. So thank you, Laura, for all you do. And it brings me to kind of I'm really talking about the policy framework in which all of these things are happening. So right, there's all of these divisions of different levels of government with different divisions within them, and I'm going to try to distill what's going on for you all, hopefully in some coherent matter. But it's not really coherent, but it's not going to give you PTSD. But I think the one thing I want to, and I think Brian touched on this a little bit, but there has been a massive divergence between policies, facts, and science over the years. You look at 1970, which was like a landmark year for environmental regulation with the passage of the National Environmental Policy Act. You have things like the Clean Air and the Clean Water Acts, right, coming into play. And ever since those have really been enacted, you would think as we continue to populate, as pressures increase, as our climate changes, policy would keep up with the pressures that we're facing. But in fact, with people like Senator Lee in office, they've actually gone the opposite direction. And so before I get into this, I'm just know where your elected officials are on environmental issues. Ask them if they are supportive of enhancing and increasing protections to environment, not just for the sake of the land, but for the sake of public health. We've seen massive deregulations, not just at the federal level, at the state, and in some instances at the county level. I've been before the county council asking them to increase stream setbacks as we're dealing with climate change and increased development. And they've held them the same, but science says you should be 300 feet from a body of water if you're going to be developing, but our ordinance says say somewhere between 50 and 100 feet. That's not good enough given the pressures that we're seeing. So the policy framework really for what this discussion with the Parley's mine, you have cities, you have the county, and you have the state. Those are the primary players. You do have some federal oversight with the EPA, as was kind of mentioned in some of the other presentations, but I'll just kind of start at that city level and work up. So Laura did an awesome job of talking about Salt Lake City's relationship, which is unique given their watershed authority and their mandate to protect water supply for the Salt Lake Valley, which also seems to be in jeopardy every single legislative session as legislators try to take away their ability to protect our water supply in deference to development and property rights. So that's one thing I'm asking you to, stay on top of. You can follow Save Our Canyons. We try to let you know when there are things that are going to jeopardize that. But we really need people to show up at the state capitol when things like this come into play. But other cities, I mean, most of us, unless you live in unincorporated Salt Lake County here, chances are you live in a city of some sort. Each of those cities has a council and a mayor. While they might not have jurisdiction on this mine, they do have a voice, as do you. And so what I think the most important thing for every person to do is to get in touch with their mayor and their city council members and ask them to pass a resolution, send it to the governor and to the legislature saying for the host of reasons that Dr. Williams laid out at the onset, we don't want this mine in Parley's Canyon. And we need laws that protect the Salt Lake County airshed. We need laws and regulations that protect our watersheds. We need laws and regulations that protect our national forests and the places that we go recreate in the Salt Lake Valley that add to our quality of life. So while cities might not have, a jurisdictional perspective, their voice is super important in this, and your voice can help mobilize that action for cities and your mayors and your city councils. So one thing you can do, and I'm kind of going to go through this saying, here's the jurisdiction and here's what you can do. So please do reach out to your mayors and just get them to pass resolutions saying no to this mine. So Salt Lake County is the jurisdiction in which this mining application has been filed. So Parley's Canyon is an unincorporated Salt Lake County, and so the land use authority is Salt Lake County. And so when in December 2021, Salt Lake County initiated a land use ordinance to prohibit mining and gravel operations in the foothills and Canyons Overlay Zone called FCAUS, which is one of our environmental ordinances, and also withdrawing that use from the underlying zone, which is the Forest and Recreation Zone, or FR zone, in which this area is sited. So if you have that zone on your property, this use of mining and mineral extraction and gravel pits is not available to you as of this spring when the county formally adopted the process. I think it's important to note that when they were going through that process, the ordinance not only went before one, but two different planning commissions in Salt Lake County. One is the Mountainous Planning Commission, which really has jurisdiction over the Wasatch Mountains, and two, the Salt Lake County Planning Commission. It's important to note that 100% of the public comment before those bodies, and I think even before the Salt Lake County Council, were all in support of the county's ordinance banning mining as an activity. So there was nobody saying, yes, please mine the Wasatch Mountains, please destroy our forest, please destroy our watershed and our airshed. That didn't happen. So the county really acted on behalf of the public interest, and I think that is very important. However, on September 8th of this year, Tree Farm, represented by their attorneys at Parr Brown, filed a lawsuit against Salt Lake County, citing that their land use ordinance was illegal. And so that brings me to, and I do want to say thank you to the mayor and the county council for taking swift action to enact an ordinance to protect our lands and public health. But that brings me to the state, because they're basically, the lawsuit alleges that Salt Lake County violated a provision of state code in enacting an ordinance, which is, you hear all the time at the legislature and from the state of Utah. Local control, people closest to the land know best, with that asterisk that I think if you live in Salt Lake City or Salt Lake County, then you don't. But the state, basically, there are several areas in the state, but that lawsuit came from it really stems from a law that was passed in 2019. And I remember seeing, I think, both Scott and Brian up at the Capitol trying to fight this law, and that passed in 2019, called the Vested Critical Infrastructure Materials Operation Act. So essentially, this law says that gravel and mining operations are critical infrastructure to the state, and that governmental entities can do nothing to interrupt with companies or property owners trying to get at that critical infrastructure. I'm just putting it in a nutshell. You're welcome to go read the code just by, you can just go to the legislative site and put in critical infrastructure materials, and it'll pop up. But that's essentially what it says. So there are two real key things in that act, and it really, as I think lawsuits do, comes down to several words in that code by my read. So one is the word vested. Do they have a vested mining use in that area? As you can see from the property and the pictures that were shown, it doesn't look like a whole lot of mining activity has ever taken place on that land. Vested use essentially means that the land has been mined, or in this fashion, at some point in the history. Therefore, they have a vested right to continue doing so. But we're not sure that that's the case in this scenario. But that's kind of where I think the suit between the county and Tree Farm is headed. And then two, it says that these vested critical infrastructure materials operations that were permitted prior can't be revoked, essentially. So this is a new application. There's never been a permit offered for this particular property. I think there are efforts for them to try and commingle properties with the Kilgore pit down the road. There were instances where we saw the Tree Farm suddenly became a 50% owner in the property. We learned that Kilgore pit also is in violation and trespass onto public lands. They've gone outside the property boundary and are actually extracting gravel without a permit on your public lands. And as soon as we made that known, suddenly the Tree Farm 50% ownership kind of fell by the wayside. So we're not sure if they are or are not a 50% owner in that. But I think their strategy was to kind of say, this is really the same piece of property as the Kilgore pit, as part of that justification for the vested and permitted uses. So somebody much smarter than me, somebody much more important than me, is really going to figure out, do they have a vested use? Was this ever permitted at some point in the past? And that's really, I think, probably sloppy distillation of the lawsuit, but I think that's kind of where that's headed. And so, as I understand it, the county has some time to basically respond to the complaint, and I think they're working through that. But I don't really have anything to update on that particular suit. So there are several other functions that the state performs, and we went over the Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining process. It was mentioned a couple of times here, but basically they're the regulatory agency for mining operations. And I think it is important to note that what they were granted earlier this spring was a small mining operation permit, which is 20 acres or less, as I understand it. But what they filed for initially was this 634 acre gravel pit. And basically in the permitting process that Dogum went through, because the large pit is a much higher bar to cross to get permission to do. So they basically allowed them to withdraw the large mining operation, kind of saying, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. You never saw that we want something bigger. Let's just treat this like the 20 acres. And it's like, no, you guys clearly want this, all of the analysis, all of everything had to do with the 650 acre mine, but they were just like, nope, erase that. Nobody ever saw that. We're just going to evaluate this. And I, I think we've been maybe justifiably a little hard on Dogum, but I think the fact of the matter is policy is not working for the public in this arena. I think even Director Baza, when he was making his decision on this, he said, you guys made a lot of good arguments about the impacts of having this operation, but that is outside of our authority to make a decision. The Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining, that you literally go to get one of these mines, all they're allowed to do for the most part is make sure that you've filled every line on the form out. Doesn't matter what the information on the form says. They are just, if you took your multiple choice bubble sheet and just randomly filled out everything, doesn't matter what the answer to the question is, really. It just matters if it's filled out. That's about the level of discretion your state agencies have in evaluating these things. And so as we go to the Division of Air Quality, which they've filed an air quality permit this past summer. So there will be I think it was just a few weeks ago. We're still in summer. It feels like, no, it is fall now. Okay. Barely. Yeah. And snowing this weekend. But anyways, I think the point is that these agencies they have not been given much discretion by the legislature. And so this is where voting and engaging with your policymakers makes a huge difference, because these regulatory agencies need to be able to push back on people that are trying to do these things to protect safety, the health of people, the health of our environments. And that is just not what they are empowered to do. They're just really allowed to look at boxes and whether the bubble's been filled in, not the contents of the bubble. So this fall, winter, there will be an air quality hearing on this permit. And I think it's really important for people to show up. And I hope Dr. Moench gives his presentation and puts, some fear into people, because I think those things are very, very true. I mean, you look at the climate crisis that we are currently in. It's because of poor regulation and our inability to look cumulatively at the impacts of our actions. That's the root of the problem, is that we're saying, well, we're following the law. Well, the law's not good enough. And then that's really what all of this comes down to. We need better laws, we need better policies, and we need better lawmakers and regulators to push back on a lot of these proposals and really understand the universe in which these things are operating, and the level of sophistication that really goes into a lot of these decisions. We have more information in this day and age. We're just not using it in the right way. Facebook knows exactly what we're doing right now, but we can't pass a law to protect, our air quality. It's just bizarre to me. Really, that's what I have on the state process, what has happened and what will happen. A lot of these authorizations are contingent on other governmental entities, on the outcome of the Salt Lake County lawsuit. So I mean, I think while this is a very important issue, and there are going to be many opportunities for engagement coming up, really, we just need to hold people accountable and try to strengthen our regulations and our policies and protect the Wasatch Mountains and stay involved and pursue policies that are supported by facts and by science to try and help people make better decisions about the activities that they're pursuing. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, all panelists. Can we have a little show of... Before we take questions from the audiences, and could we use this microphone here so they'll be on the TV? I want to take the moderator's privilege and ask maybe 1.5 questions. I appreciate Carl's last presentation suggesting there's going to be a hearing in the fall, but I didn't get who was doing this hearing. And so I want to say, could each one of you list what's coming up where interested people could be taking an advocacy position? And then after that question, Carl's going to answer the questions that I didn't get the notes on, but the rest of you may have another idea, other suggestions. And then I want to just invite you, does anyone on the panel want to ask a question or expand what another panelist said? So hearing, what is this hearing we're having?
So several weeks ago, they filed an air quality permit that goes along with this gravel pit operation. So the Utah Department of Environmental Quality, Division of Air Quality will hold a hearing on the air quality permit. So that's what is coming up. I don't have any dates for that, but they basically, I think they had something like 160 days or something from the date that they filed that paperwork to have a hearing is kind of the rule that the Division of Air Quality is working on.
And actually, there'll be a 30-day public comment period in addition to that hearing. So the public will have 30 days to comment on the air quality impacts of this mine. And that will be announced by the Division of Air Quality when that 30-day clock starts. And if you stay in touch with Save Our Canyons, you'll get that information.
I just want to add the characterization that Carl offered about how Dogum basically has its hands tied behind its back because of state law. The same is absolutely true of the DAQ. I talked to the director of the DAQ about this specific project, and he says they will get their permit from the DAQ regardless of all of these considerations. So just to amplify your point, state law is absolutely grossly inadequate in protecting us.
I think another manifestation of that is if you look at who's on the boards of these divisions. So the Board of Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining is all people from the oil, gas, and mining industry. There's no one on that board who represents the interests of the public. And the Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining doesn't have the authority to say it's not a good idea to put a mine on this property. They only can say, you own this property, you want to put a mine on it, you've checked all the boxes, you get to do it. And so, and Division of Air Quality basically has mostly people from industry on the board of the Division of Air Quality too. There's really not sufficient expertise in public health, like Brian was talking about, the impacts of all that. That expertise doesn't exist on the Board of Air Quality. So the other thing, and I sort of both an opportunity for input and a question to Carl, is one of our concerns is there may be bills in this upcoming legislative session that could weaken the county's land use authority or provide a shortcut for this mine to get approved. And so we want the public to be aware of the fact that these bills could emerge. They could emerge at the last hour in the legislative session. And we need people to be willing to call their legislators if such a bill were to emerge. And Carl might want to say more about that because this is what he does from January 15th through March 1st.
Yeah. And we're in the process of hiring a policy associate so we can have a little bit better presence and better coverage, given all the pressures that we're seeing in the Wasatch right now. But, you know, I think the fear that we have is, I mean, as as poor as the laws are in protecting the Wasatch and protecting us from these issues, and the county's land use authority, or even the city's ability to have land use. I think that the fear is that the legislature may just take those things away in total in some of these areas. So I think we've definitely heard rumblings of saying, Salt Lake County thinks that they can ban mining operations in the Wasatch Mountains. Well, maybe Salt Lake County doesn't deserve land use authority at all. At which point you're kind of just scratching your head and saying, like, well, why do we even have local or regional governments? We're just all, I guess, subject to the paternalism of the state.
I would take it one step further. I would say that we are virtually guaranteed to have a bill like what Scott just described appear in the way he just described it, because it will be massively unpopular. And so the legislature's technique for getting around that is to file it at the last minute so the public has no real chance to mobilize its opposition to it. And given the amount of money that Jesse Lastly and Granite Construction have poured into this, I think you can safely say it's guaranteed they will try and do exactly that.
There are possibly some other permitting entities to look out for. I mentioned earlier that a water right change application would have to be filed in order to move the tree farm water rights to the new point of diversion for the new type of water use. That goes through a public process through the state engineer's office. And the way you can track that is by the water rights that they own are actually on the state engineer's website, and you can flag them for updates on whether or not there's any change applications on those. And then there's a protest period that can occur before a decision is made. There will likely be some kind of application, if there hasn't already been, on stormwater pollution and prevention. That goes through the State Division of Water Quality. And a stormwater pollution prevention plan has to be created. And I'm not sure if this one would go out for public comment, but I can check that out too. And the final one would be if the proposed mine wants water from Salt Lake City, that would be an application to Salt Lake City. So.
And I think it's there was one more permit that happened in this process, which was a 404 permit for a stream alteration. That was actually denied by so that would be the Army Corps, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
Well, it was postponed.
Okay.
It was postponed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
that was that also is the state
Engineer.
engineer's office, state engineer's office. Yes.
But they said, because you don't have a DOGM permit yet, we're not going to act on this. And so now that they have their DOGM permit, I think they'll probably reapply for that.
One more follow-up question. Given that some of you on the panel believe that the current state of the law is inadequate and are predicting further harmful laws to be proposed, is there anybody that might be proposing an improvement to the law, maybe one targeted exactly to the concern you have that they're going to try to change county power, so that bill would have to be come up together with the bill you're imagining? And who might run such bills? That
I mean, it's not for lack of trying to try and find a legislator to run a bill, but usually the response we get is we have a finite number of bills, and this has a snowball's chance in hell of passing the state legislature. And I said, well, can you at least try, please? Like, just try. I think there's a lot to be said for trying, but they said, well, it's not going to pass, so why try? That seems to be the state of our legislature.
Can I just add to that I think the key is not necessarily finding a legislator to sponsor this bill. The key is mobilizing massive public opposition to it. Many of you may recall there was a grandma bill that passed the legislature in about 2013. The Salt Lake Tribune ran a front page story about how awful this grandma bill was, because it would basically shut down the public's access to mount any sort of watchdogging or oversight of the government. We then almost spontaneously were one of many groups that organized a rally in opposition to that. And within about 24 hours, we had a rally of about 1,500 people against this bill. And spontaneously, I don't want you to think that we started the first insurrection in Utah, but spontaneously, about half of that crowd of 1,500 people stormed the chambers of the legislature on just this bill. Governor Herbert eventually decided that this couldn't stand, and the legislature reversed themselves. But it happened because of widespread, massive public opposition. And that's probably how we're going to have to get change in this particular arena.
One thing to watch for is so there's a couple of paths. One is they would have to sort of pass a bill that would reduce the land use authority of all the counties or all the class 1 counties. And obviously to target a bill just on Salt Lake County's land use authority, there's probably a way to do it, because there's a way to take a tax increment away from Salt Lake City if you want to. But I think that would be one path. The other path would be to try to change the general ordinance around county land use authority, which the Utah Association of Counties would oppose, or the League of Cities and Towns would oppose. And so we do have allies in this area of trying to maintain local control. And that gets back to Carl's point of making sure that your mayor, your county mayor or your city mayor is educated about this issue, that they pass an ordinance that they don't want to see this gravel pit, and that before a bill surfaces, they know that they have opposition within that local government group.
I think it's time for questions from the audience. Do we have anybody online? Do we have anybody here in the audience that wants to come forward and talk into this sole microphone? This one here, you'll be on camera.
Mhm.
We're doing that one? Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, Tracy Schmidt, I have a part owner of the cabin down there.
Turn it on.
Hit the button, yeah.
Oh, the question I've got is, we didn't talk about UDOT and also the Richards owning property. So I'm interested about, is there, what are the permitting processes? This is a huge mining operation for them to, what would UDOT have to do? What would UDOT have to fund around access in and out of the mine? And also the Richards, that do they own, would they have to pass through the Richards property and get some kind of access through that?
So we've tried to get UDOT to engage with us on this, and they won't talk to us. There's a little bit of a concern with UDOT because UDOT actually uses these materials, and so they have contracts with Granite Construction, and so it's hard to know exactly what UDOT's position is. But to answer your question, they would need a right-of-way from UDOT to get off of exit 132 and then cross UDOT property to get into their property. They wouldn't necessarily need to cross the Richards Family Partnership property to do that. But the Richards Family Partnership has an adjacent property line with Tree Farm that extends the full length of the property from the freeway up to the top of the ridge. And so they certainly have the most significant property interests in how this mine would affect their property values and their property rights.
Do we have something from online? No. You've answered all the questions for the people on Zoom.
Or we put them to sleep.
My name is Andrew Smith. Thank you for this meeting and the panel and the good information and summary and the review of all this. Scott had a slide with a list of agencies, and at the very bottom it said State of Utah in red. Everything else was in blue. Question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark.
It said state legislature. Yeah.
State legislature. Right. So I have kind of a comment about, where's Governor Cox? office? What have they ever said about this issue? Dogum said it's been overwhelming public comment that dragged this along, and they had to think about it. They had to do all these different things. The county got involved. The Mill Creek City's been involved. Salt Lake City's involved. A lot of people have been involved. What do we do as a grassroots people here? We know we need to go vote, but how long does that change take by us voting in 3 weeks? What can we do now? And I've seen that question mark in red on state legislature. Carl, you mentioned some things about the legislature and writing letters and doing things, but I keep thinking about where's the governor's office in all of this? What's going on? What are your feelings about why there has not been anything said out of the governor's office, and why and what? So part two is, what can we do in this room and listening to and our community councils across the Salt Lake and the city and the county? How can we mobilize and what can we do? Thanks.
I'm glad you brought that up. Let me tell you just briefly a little story. Some of you may remember around 2012, 2013, that there was a proposal by the Southern Nevada Water Authority to drain the Great Basin aquifers in Snake Valley and in central Nevada and send that water to Las Vegas. And Governor Herbert sent his director of natural resources around the state, basically telling people that the state of Utah supported this. Why, I have no idea, but that went on for about 2 years because Utah would basically have to sign on to this agreement. Well, the concern of the public health advocates in the state, including the Utah Medical Association, which is a very conservative organization, was that you drain the aquifers out of central Nevada and you create from the Great Basin Desert, you turn it into the Sahara Desert, because these phreatophytes that send roots down 60 feet and tap into the aquifers will die. And so all the vegetation that keeps the dust from blowing over from Nevada into Utah will be gone. It'll be the biggest environmental disaster in our history. And so Herbert went around having his DNR director tell everybody, we're going to sign it, we're going to sign it. So we organized a massive phone banking campaign and had people call the governor's office constantly for 2 weeks. I don't know how many calls he got, but it was in the several hundreds. 2 weeks later, Governor Herbert said, nope, we're not going to sign it. Now, I don't know if Herbert would ever admit that that campaign made a difference, but in fact, I do think it speaks to the fact that in various forms, public opposition, calling the governor's office, calling your state legislature, protests, rallies, whatever it takes, that's the key to having public policy emerge that actually protects the public rather than is crafted by our legislature.
And I might just offer a little different perspective, because I think the governor's out to lunch on a lot of issues, frankly, that concern our watersheds in the Wasatch Mountains and this issue in Parley's. We gave him a petition, sent him a petition with 35,000 signatures and requested a meeting with him. The invitation still stands, but we haven't heard a peep from Governor Gondola.
But I agree with you, and it's discouraging. But I do think there's a limit to how long our public officials can remain disconnected from the public sentiment.
You think that's because he's an alfalfa farmer? I mean, he
Don't get me started on that.
Doesn't get the water issues because of his own background.
I'll say that I do agree that sort of that constant and sustained outreach is really helpful in a government agency. I mean, I see that in Salt Lake City government all the time too, where, and this isn't to say anybody's right or wrong, but we all work in our kind of silos because we're very functionalized in government, and we are departmentalized. We have divisions. We all have laws that we are bound to follow, federal laws and other state laws, and sometimes they conflict with each other. And I do sometimes think that on an issue as complicated as this, that constant and sustained outreach to state leaders, to the department heads. I mean, Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining has a boss. That's Department of Natural Resources, and so I think that it does make a difference, notwithstanding anybody's
No, and I'm not.
frustration, but just sort of the nature of government can sometimes, it's bureaucratic.
And if I could just quickly add to that, just sort of as the flip side of Brian's story is we had a bill when I was at Heal, Utah, and that was going to increase Energy Solutions' ability to accept more nuclear waste. And we met with the governor's office and we said, you need to do something about this bill. And they said, we're not getting any calls about this bill. And so I think they do monitor that kind of stuff. I'm not sure a petition is always the same as that constant influx of calls that Brian was talking about, but I think it would be good for people to go home and call Governor Cox's office and say, we do not want to have, if this is how you feel, we do not want to have this gravel pit in Parley's Canyon. I can guarantee you if he got 100 calls over the next week, it would be at a different place on his radar.
We have a question from online.
Okay, this question is from Justin. From personal experience, I can confirm that Parley's Canyon is frequently windy, and the canyon seems to act as a wind tunnel. There are tens of thousands of homes within a few miles of this proposed gravel pit, as well as dozens of schools, many parks, and businesses. Surrounding areas include Canyon Rim, Mill Creek Country Club, Olympus Cove, and Sugar House. How far can 10 and 2.5 micron fugitive dust travel, and are these homes within the range, especially during wind events?
The smallest particles that are the most toxic because of their size, and the reason why the toxicity is related to size, I didn't get a chance to really elaborate on much on this further, is because that's the smallest particles are the most easily inhaled. They're the most difficult to exhale. They're the most easily picked up by the bloodstream, and then the most easily delivered throughout the body, entering any cell in the body, including the critical organs. So the smallest particles are the most toxic. They are also suspended the longest in the atmosphere. So these smaller particles will go further than the visibility that you might associate with fugitive dust, because most of that visibility are the larger particles that Scott talked about, PM10 and so forth. So there's not necessarily a correlation between where you can see the dust and where the health impacts will occur. We know, in fact, that dust can travel thousands of miles. In fact, we trace dust from the Sahara Desert to South America, which actually feeds nutrients to the Amazon jungle. The dust can go everywhere, and it does. And in fact, having spent 20 years at LDS Hospital, we could see from the vantage point of LDS Hospital, the dust from the gravel pit at Geneva at the point of the mountain over the entire valley. Nobody who's ever entered Salt Lake City from the north would fail to notice the gravel pit dust in North Salt Lake. That also gets throughout the valley. And then you add to that the dust from the Kennecott's tailings ponds, and then you add to that the dust from the disappearing Great Salt Lake. We have a dust bowl. And the last thing we need is another source. But specifically, this particular location will send dust primarily down the canyon, but sometimes up the canyon, and it will go literally for miles and miles and miles. And the worst particles will go the furthest and stay in the atmosphere the longest.
One of the problems is that the canyon is a funnel, but the wide end of the funnel happens at the mouth of the canyon, right? So as the dust blows out of the canyon and then it disperses across the whole valley, the closest state air monitor to this gravel pit is at Hawthorne Elementary School on 7th East and 17th South. there are no air quality monitors east of 7th East in the entire Salt Lake Valley. So the impacts, as Brian was talking about, these microclimates of pollution, the impacts on the people in Canyon Rim and Sugar House and Foothill and Mill Creek are going to be much, much different than they are when they get out into the valley and mix with everything else. And the state may say, well, we're not picking up major blips on our monitors. It's because they don't have monitors that would detect that.
And early on in the process, we wanted to. I talked to a number of modelers, environmental modelers, because we wanted to do a dust modeling kind of to figure out exactly the extent. And we talked to people, and it would probably cost us, $10,000-$20,000 or something to do this modeling. But the response we got was, for what? Because no regulatory body cares about that information or can hang their hat on it. So it would have been great to educate the public, but at the end of the day, it would do little or nothing to inform public policy. So that's kind of goes back to my point about there's a lot of information, there's a lot of modeling, there's a lot of analysis we can do, but until we have laws that will accept that analysis from anybody other than the developer proposing to do it, it just ends up being a waste of money, really, at the end of the day.
One more question I see in the background, and then I think we're gonna have to wrap it up because we've kept you over time for this class.
Thank you. My name is Richard Hammond, and I have a couple of questions. One, a thought. Scott, you mentioned in your presentation that the senator, Senator Lee, his campaign is being run by the law
Election
firm
High, yeah.
advertising.
It's the public relations firm, yeah.
Is there any implication? What is the end result of him participating that they may ask favors in behalf of this that we do not know of? Now, he's a senator, but that's a question that came up. We talked about the governor, the legislature. What about the senator?
So he also is involved in the campaigns of the president of the Utah Senate and the Speaker of the Utah House. So our concerns are more his connections with state legislative leaders. I don't know that Mike Lee has a real role related to this particular gravel pit. I'm not as worried about that, but I'm more worried about his connections within the Utah legislature.
I would only add that he wants to get rid of the EPA, which has an implication.
Right, which is a little bigger than just this gravel pit.
Well, to follow up on Scott's comment, Lee doesn't have a role because he chooses not to have a role. He chooses not to be engaged in this issue. And whether or not it's because he has the same PR firm as Jesse Lashley has, who's to say? But he, for whatever reason, and it's probably a lot of it ideologically driven, he chooses to remain detached from this issue.
The other thing is interesting on air quality. From my experience of 30, 40 years ago, being in weather and broadcasting, I haven't heard anyone talk about the source, which is, I think, a very big source that we should access, and that's the Weather Service. Because when you're talking about the air, the problem with our valley is it is a bowl, and there's very few outlets of which that air can go. Now, predominantly, probably 70% of the time, we have what is called the Great Basin High, which takes up residence over the western states. A high pressure is warm air suppressing the pollutants down. It has no way of ventilating. So this mine, the only place it can go unless we have a low pressure that is above us to allow it to ventilate, is going to be suppressed. And we have that problem even during the summertime. If you've noticed, we just came in from St. George. And as soon as we got past Utah County, there was a plume over the valley. It's not a winter phenomenon. And so this acts to suppress everything. And that mine, that dust, the phenomenon of the canyons will all usher it in there, and it has no place to go. That would be a great source to give stats and figures of how bad our situation is and why do we add to it. Thank you.
I think we've had enough questions. We need to wrap things up. I'm going to give the panel, and my guess is for the people in the room, we'll be able to mingle and ask further follow-up discussion for a little bit. I'm going to give each one of our panelists a chance to say the 2 sentences or 3 sentences that you haven't said yet that you just want to conclude with, and then I have to do some wrap-up comments.
Call your mayor, call your legislator, call the governor's office.
I'll just reiterate a comment that I made earlier, and that is there is a limit to how long our politicians can remain disconnected from public sentiment. It's up to the public to make sure that that disconnect doesn't continue.
I don't know if I have any. Might be. I mean, I guess just, you know, looking at our understanding the impacts, the cumulative impacts of not just this, but a lot of different things that are happening. I think that broader context is important because we continue to have a lot of these types of proposals, and our water resources aren't getting any bigger, and our population's growing and our climate's changing. So we've got a lot of stressors. We don't need to add more to them.
Yeah, I think public engagement is absolutely critical. If 35,000 people, you know, trying to tell the governor isn't enough, then I guess we need 100,000. So help us do that, right? You know, so we just need to keep figuring out, you know, what number of people the governor will listen to, and we need you to be part of it. And just I would say, vote for people who believe in facts and will have our policies mirror science and reality.
And Linda, one more thing, don't send emails, call them or meet with them. That emails are not that effective anymore. They get so many of them, they don't really pay attention to them. It's really much better to make a phone call. And if you could meet with them, it's even better.
Thank you very much. Can we thank our panelists? Thank you, speakers, members of the public, attending in person, attending online. Everyone who found tonight's event useful, take a few minutes to like or share related posts on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. This will be posted shortly on our website. What's up next with the League? Unit meetings. Monday, October 24th at 7:30 p.m. at the Holiday Library, and on Zoom, the Night Owls unit will meet. Tuesday, October 25th at 11 a.m. on Zoom, the Summit Wasatch County unit will have a virtual tour of the step-by-step procedure for counting ballots in Summit County, led by Summit County Clerk Terry Goodall. Wednesday, October 26th at 3:30, members of the Salt Lake City unit will have an election tour. Our next general meeting will be November 16th. That's the 3rd Wednesday in November at 6 p.m. And we're dealing with reproductive justice. The well-known and soon to retire Carrie Galloway of Planned Parenthood Utah will be speaking, as will Professor Leslie Francis, a law professor specializing in health law. And finally, December 5th and 14th, there are naturalization ceremonies. Volunteers are still needed. And December 7th, there is a social and fundraiser for those of you out there that aren't members of the League yet. So with that, let me close. Thank you once again.
And thank you to the League of Women Voters.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.